listening to the Rainmaking Podcast, hosted by high-stakes headhunter, author, and professional speaker, Scott Love.
Hey everyone, this is Scott Love, and thanks for joining me on the Rainmaking Podcast. So a lot of our shows are dealing on managing the crisis. How do you deal with client development? How do you manage work-life balance and all the other things associated with that? And today, we're talking about stepping into difficult conversations in a time of a crisis. And our expert today is Rudhir Krishtel, who is an expert on client development. He's an executive coach and a facilitator. He works with lawyers and the legal community. He works on a wide range of issues, including career strategy, business development, building leadership skills, navigating workplace relationships, and even diversity and inclusion challenges. Rudhir practiced law for 15 years as a litigation partner and then as senior counsel at Apple. His lawyer days even led him to train as a yoga teacher and a mindfulness meditation instructor. And he brings some of those insights to us today. I think you're going to find some great content in today's show. Thanks for listening. Hey, this is Scott Love. Thanks for joining me on the Rainmaking Podcast. Today, we've got a special guest, Rudhir Krishtel. And today, we're talking about stepping into difficult conversations in a time of crisis. Rudhir, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Now, Rudhir, you've got a great reputation in the business development community. Tell us a little bit about how you got into the work of what you're doing currently. What was your path as you got into that role?
I practiced law for 15 years. I was a partner at a national law firm, Fish & Richardson, in an IP practice. And then for 5 years, I moved to the Bay Area where I am now and was senior in-house counsel at Apple. And after 15 years in the practice, I started to notice that the more senior I got, the more difficult it felt like to have open dialogue around what was difficult. It almost felt lonelier the further up you got. And it was interesting because I'm a pretty interactive and social person. And yet I felt like some of the most unique challenges that I faced in the practice, I wasn't comfortable sharing with others. And so I noticed that. And I noticed that not only as my own sort of personal behavior, but also a pattern in the practice that people were really looking for safe spaces to get advisement on important issues. And after noticing that about myself and others, I left the practice. And so after 15 years, I left. I took a year off and I retrained. I trained as an executive coach. And I also trained as a mindfulness and yoga instructor, allowing me to better understand how people manage difficulty and how they work with difficulty. And I took all that training and I started a coaching practice about 2.5 years ago now. And it's been going great.
That's great. And like I said earlier, you've got a great reputation in that area. And let me ask you this, how do you think the mindfulness part of it, how do you think that made an impact to you from the perspective of a business developer?
So much of our hangups and challenges with business development relate to our mindset, and they relate to the difficulties that we experience in that process. And a lot of those difficulties are, how we engage with others, what we might be afraid to ask for, and even how we view ourselves with respect to others. And a lot of those challenges, I feel like, are a mindset shift. And so mindfulness practices go a significantly long way in allowing us to relieve ourselves of some of that thinking. You hear a lot about growth mindset now. And people that have this mindset around the pie is big, that there's actually a lot of opportunity, that there's a lot of chance. Shifting your mind towards that can go a really long way. So I find mindfulness practices to obviously be very valuable for managing stress and managing difficulty, but really as a tool to help you shift your mindset, because so much of the challenges that people face with business development are, they're stories that they're telling themselves about their practice that actually aren't true.
Right. That's interesting because if you think about, let's talk about IP partners, since you identify with people like that. Some of those people might not be exactly swashbuckling rainmakers, but it's their job to get out there and close the sale and get the accounts and earn the trust of these in-house counsel. So I'm sure that could be a stressful situation for somebody that's really having to kind of focus on their BD efforts.
Well, so the practice is already stressful, right? Any IP litigator out there listening, any litigator generally listening, knows the practice of law is stressful. It's now you're drained in your energy by the end of the day. And then you have to turn to business development. And that's difficult. Your mind is already thinking about your cases, you're thinking about your workload. And now I got this hour that I may have even earmarked or not, where it's just sort of the last thing on the list of things to do. And there's no energy for it.
Yeah.
And so when we think about managing our stress and mindfulness practices, oftentimes improving how we relate to the practice can actually increase the amount of energy we have for actually engaging with others. And the other part of it is that when you're practicing as a litigator, it's a pretty combative practice, since you're often in this situation where you are working against opposing counsel and you're competing on teams and working with a group of others. And there's not a lot of time or energy to really be thinking about, how you could add value to other clients. And so at this point, you're so caught up in the work itself that you're not often thinking about the ways in which you could add value to so many other people, companies, organizations, et cetera. And so your mind just doesn't go to that. And so I feel like really rethinking how we associate and relate to the practice can really make a big difference in business development.
That's a progressive idea. I really like that. And then plus you add on the other variable of the world's largest healthcare crisis on top of that. And then it kind of doubles down the amount of stress, anxiety, and feelings that people feel in this crisis. So what do you think, with the context of the pandemic and how people in business development roles relating to this, what do you think is happening right now in this COVID era that relates to your work?
Well, I think you hit it right on the head. I mean, just think about it. There's these layers of things happening underneath us right now that we're probably thinking about, or we may not even be thinking about all day. But we hit a health crisis. We hit an economic crisis. We hit isolation, social distancing and isolation in some regards. There's social unrest. And then out here on the West Coast now and across the country, there's some environmental challenges. And so with all of that going on, and obviously parenting and the challenges that families are having within their home.
I was going to bring that up also. Kids in school.
Many layers, right?
Yeah.
So of course, what happens? We get a bit more stressed. We get a bit more reactive than usual. And definitely by, towards the end of this year, people start feeling that more and more because it compounds.
Let me kind of ask you to put on your mindfulness coach hat for a little bit then. What do you recommend? How could people cope with this? Before we kind of talk about the conversations, what do you think people can do from a mindfulness perspective to kind of be able to cope and really thrive in this environment?
Yeah, I think a lot about what we need to do to build our resilience. And when I think about resilience, there's the difficulties in life. And so if you put your left hand out, you can sort of weigh the difficulties. It's like work, health, family, and then this whole COVID 2020 layer. And so that left hand is sort of weighing down. And so the right hand, you think about the things that restore you, the resources, and you kind of want your resources to outweigh what's difficult. And so what are the resources that we have? We eat well. We try to get some exercise. We try to get our sleep in. We have community. And then maybe we have some mental and emotional and spiritual practices that support us too. And because that whole framework has shifted this year, we might not have the social support we used to have. We're not spending time with our colleagues and our friends as much. And maybe some of our other outlets have gone away, going to the gym or whatever else that people did last year that they're not going to do this year. They want to really think about the things that they can do that restore themselves and balance the week out a little bit so that, if you're spending and you're grinding all week, that there is some restoration time on the weekends or in the evenings. And I think people want to think about what restores them. And most people will tell you things that are actually pretty, absolutely free, very straightforward. I want to go for a walk outside. I'd love to get into nature, watching some TV. And I find that mindfulness practices on top of this have a huge benefit, which is really just sitting, meditating for about 10 minutes a day. 10 to 20 minutes ends up offering a lot of clarity, a lot of peace of mind, slows the mind down, and makes you less reactive. And so I think for those that are, listening, I think if you're able to dedicate 10 to 20 minutes a day and get that in, even in the breaks, when a call ends early, whatever it is, just sit, pay attention to the breath, put on a guided audio meditation, whatever works for you. You'll find in weeks and months that so much has shifted.
Let me come back to that in a second, because I'm going to kind of go down that path. But first I wanted to ask you this. It's like if you sailed I went to the Naval Academy, so we did a lot of sailing there, and we learned that you can always see where the wind is coming from by looking up at the sail, and they have these little ribbons sewn into the sail called tells. And you would look at those, and it would be an indicator of the direction of the wind. What are some of those tells, those indicators that people have in their lives where they see that maybe they're getting a little bit out of balance? Maybe they're starting to go down an unhealthy path. What are some of the things that you've seen from your work in consulting to people on this in this area?
Lawyers are really good at doing intake with others. When you're deposing someone else, or if you're, connecting with a client, asking them about a challenge that they're facing, or, interviewing a witness, whatever it might be. We're good at intake. Mm-hmm. What we want to do is intake about ourselves and just do a check-in. Right. I think the body is the first place to start. Is there tension in the body? Do I feel stress? What does stress feel like? Is it a little bit different than how I feel at different parts of the week? What are the things that move me to that place? And so I often invite clients to just actually take stock, gather the data in the way that they do with their clients. Keep a small spreadsheet, date and time. What are the moments that cause you stress? And how does that rate 0 to 10? And then just take a look at the data for the course of the week or course of 2 weeks.
That's great. I like that. So documenting this.
You start to notice the trends and the patterns, you can start responding to it. But we want to do intake first.
That's a great idea. I like that. And let's kind of get back to the meditation part, and then I want to go more into the difficult conversations part. But what are some action steps people could take if they wanted to meditate? What do they do? Just make a list of all their big problems and think about those for 10 minutes? Or how does that work? What do you recommend?
For people that do not have a meditation practice, there are very, very accessible ways to start. There's a lot of incredible apps out there like Headspace and Calm and Insight Timer, and they offer these guided meditations that are, 4, 6, 10, 15 minutes, whatever you want to start with. On my website, I have a list of guided meditations that I often use and invite people to check out.
Yeah, we'll put that link on the show notes also for people that are listening that want to check that out.
Yeah, and for people that are just trying out for the first time, download one of the apps, visit my website. There's a few other resources too, and just sit for 10 minutes, listen to a guide, which is somebody else just inviting you to check in with your breath, pay attention to what's happening in the body, and just quiet down for a little bit. And do it for 10 minutes a day for a week or for 2 weeks. And then, feel free to email me or just check in with the changes you've experienced and just take note. It's not about how you feel after that first session. It is really more of how you feel after a couple of weeks or a month or two of regular practice. It's something that builds over time. It's like inviting someone that's never worked out in their life to work out once. And then, you must have felt all the benefits after that first workout. No.
Right.
The real benefit comes after some consistent practice. And people that are doing that, when I did it, I started regularly meditating when I was at Apple. And, my stress at Apple, my stress as a litigator, proudly, 0 to 10, what's your stress? A doctor would ask you. And I would say, I'm a 12. And I've always wear that stress with pride. Right. And I'm sure there are attorneys out there that resonate with that. It's like, no, I have a lot of stress and I'm supposed to because I'm a lawyer. Naturally, that went down to about a 7 out of 10 in-house because at least I was sleeping at night, which is different than, counsel life. But when I started meditating, it went from a 7 to a 2. Wow. And, the doctor would ask me like, what do you do? And I would tell them what I do. And they were just shocked that I was a 2 out of 10 on stress. And when I started meditating, it made all the difference in my practice. And I showed up with less stress. I showed up much more present in meetings. I was less reactive. The things that, would trigger me in the workplace just weren't affecting me. And I had a lot more energy. I stopped drinking. I haven't drank coffee since, essentially. And so it's just made such a big difference all around.
That's great, Rudhir. Let's kind of bring it back in the direction then of the conversations. And let me ask you this. You've done both sides. You've been a business developer selling work. You've been a recipient of the services. And you've been an executive that chooses where you spend the money. What do you think some of these difficult conversations are right now between those involved in selling work and their clients and prospective clients?
Yeah, and I think I want to bring it back a little bit to 2020 and this COVID layer before we dive even further. And that's just to say that with all of that underlying energy, people may find that it's actually a little bit harder to step into these conversations. And just notice, you might have a little bit more reluctance or hesitancy to engage in dialogue. And so when it comes to business development, I think the biggest difficult question that people tend to face is actually just making that ask, right? Connecting with a client and actually asking them that, I'd love to help them and I'd love to support them, and figuring out ways to actually support their business with legal services. But sometimes right now, with everything going on, people might think I'm burdening someone. People are going to see right through me and think I'm going to be asking, for something from them. And there's a lot of things that we might tell ourselves that might get in the way of connecting with potential clients or even our current clients to either invite in business or even expand business with someone that you're working with. And so just notice and pay attention. Have you connected up with potential leads in the recent past? Have you worked on building community in certain ways? Have you started to make, have business conversations with them? Have you asked anyone for business in the recent past, or have you talked to someone about expanding your work with them? And just be curious about your comfort or your discomfort with that. And especially now with everything else going on.
What do you think are some of the big stressful conversations, like specifically from your work as a consultant to people in business development roles? Is it resolving conflict with clients? Is it selling work? Is it overcoming objections? What are some of the more common stressful conversations right now?
One of the more difficult ones is actually even sharing business or how to split points with your colleagues and your partners. And so now you've worked hard to bring someone in, and it was someone else's client before, or someone had a relationship, or, people that are early on in their business development practice will find success with potential clients and then realize that there's either conflicts or issues with sharing credit with their colleagues. And those aren't easy conversations to have for folks.
Right. So how do you deal with that? What do you recommend? If they have, let's just say they've got a shared client or whatever the credit's going to be, and they've got to go talk to a colleague, someone where their arms are supposed to be locked together in unity. How do you think they can make that conversation happen, especially right now with all the other stresses of COVID?
Yeah, and just first think about it. Is it an easy conversation, or is it a hard one? And if you feel like it's going to be a hard one, what's the resistance? And this is where I actually bring it back to the mindfulness piece a little bit, is when something's about to be difficult and we're going to engage in a difficult conversation with somebody, check in. This is the moment to do that intake. What happens in the body? A lot of people talk about, man, I actually feel a little tight in the chest, or my shoulders tighten up, or, I feel it on my brow, rubbing my forehead as I think about having to engage in dialogue with that person. And so just noticing that first, right? Let's take a step back from the actual strategy and the problem solving and just notice what happens to us when we think about having a conversation with that partner, that person who we think is never going to let go of any credit from this particular client. And you just notice people feel a shortness of breath, they feel a nervousness, they feel their pulse raise, and they feel their temperature get high. And so just checking in with that and seeing if you can notice it, maybe calm that down a little bit. Underneath that, that's sort of the body's fight or flight protection mechanism coming up. I'm about to have a difficult conversation, the body starts tensing up. Underneath that, there might be some negative message that you are telling yourself that is not true, that you don't have value vis-a-vis this more senior partner, that you don't deserve the credit on this one. There's something that you're telling yourself that's making this difficult. And so we often think about that other person as the difficult one. But I actually want to investigate a little bit closer and just be curious about something that you might be telling yourself about this conversation that actually cuts against yourself.
Where do you think that comes from for most people when they feel like they're an imposter or they're second guessing themselves? Where do you think that comes from?
It's long-standing behavior patterns that come up over a long period of time. So, it can date back from early periods in life or examples where things didn't go right. We often tend to lock in on the few things that go wrong. But if we think about our life, if you're listening to this call and you're a rainmaker or on your way there, by and large, things have worked out. And yet, as lawyers, because we are trained to issue spot and look around corners and identify the problem, our mind tends to really focus in on the problem. And that's really great for the legal work. But it's really, impactful negatively, adversely when it comes to your relationships with others.
Right.
So you don't always want to focus on that one negative thing that happened. So there may be a really tough conversation you had with a partner last year where someone really kind of smacked you down on something, and you hold on to that. And that may get in the way of this conversation that you're having right now.
So do you think to make these conversations more productive, and they're challenging, and like we mentioned, you've got the layer of the crisis on top of that doubles down the stress and, just the likelihood of people feeling that stress. Do you think there's certain skills that people can develop to really master these tough, challenging conversations?
Yeah. First, I think it is getting comfortable with that uncomfortable feeling, right? That tightness that you feel. Just slow that down.
And so how do you think they could do that? If they feel it, they've got to talk to their colleague, they set up the Zoom call or the phone call, it's 15 minutes until it happens and they start feeling that. What do you think they can do to manage that?
Yeah, step one, I love deep breathing or belly breathing. And belly breathing is a technique. Look it up on YouTube. Harvard Medical has a video on how to do it. This is not, some sort of esoteric practice. It's a very common practice. We tend to get shallow in our breath when we get nervous, and belly breathing increases the oxygen in the
Interesting.
body. So
Interesting. Something that simple makes a difference.
Makes a huge difference. I have litigators that are clients that text me right before trial. They're like, man, I'm doing those 7 belly breaths you told me to do, and it actually made a difference. I'm going into my opening argument and I feel a lot better.
That's great.
Even the experts get nervous before something that they've done many times. And so bringing oxygen back into the body, a lot of it goes a long way in settling your nerves. It reminds your body that you're safe, and you can sort of calm down and collect your head.
That's such a great idea. That's something that's simple. Anybody can do anywhere.
Deeply valuable too. Listeners, do it right now. Take 3 deep breaths and just see how it feels. And you'll feel just a little bit calmer, a little bit more gathered, and a little bit more centered. So that's the first step. Is just get comfortable with that feeling that's uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Second, be curious. What is it that I'm saying to myself that makes me feel like I'm not ready for this conversation, or that they might be thinking about me that's negative? I'm not senior enough. I didn't do enough work here. There's this negative message that we're telling ourselves, and write it down. Like, what is it that you feel like they are saying about you before you call them, or that you're saying about yourself that might be cutting against yourself? And just be curious about it.
And so you could just put it on a yellow sticky note and just write it down. It's out of your head. You're looking at it. You're assessing it.
Now you're able to look at it objectively. That's right. You're just sort of looking at it as sort of a third party. You're like, Scott is telling himself that he's not, up to snuff, compared to this partner. Whatever it is that you're telling yourself, whatever it might be, different for everybody. Write down the evidence against it. Write down and understand the evidence, why that assumption that you make about yourself, that negative, adverse assumption that you're making about yourself, write down why it's absolutely not true. Now you're the lawyer collecting evidence. You're the lawyer collecting evidence on your behalf. So now you're just absolutely writing down the reasons why what you think is actually not true. So now we're sort of questioning the mind. The mind tells us, it's getting us nervous with something we're worried about. It's like, why am I even worried? I'm worried because I think this about myself, whatever it may be. Let's write down the reasons why it's not true. And those reasons are, this was your client. You connected with them. You reached out over the last few months. You're the person that did the work and, generated their interest in working with the firm. Whatever the reasons are, the top 10 reasons, 15 reasons, 20, make the list long. And you'll start to realize that some of that thinking that's worrying you about this conversation are actually not true. That me fighting for these points are going to, ruin how I'm being perceived at the firm. Like, there's all these things that we start telling ourselves that may or may not be true, that this partner will never give me work again. Whatever it is that you say to yourself, you got to be really curious. Is that absolutely true?
And you know what? I had a thought, Rudhir. Everything that you're talking about is exactly what, when those that have done sports, you're managing your emotions as you're playing in your game, whether it's golf. I play a lot of golf. And the things that you're talking about, these certain mantras and rituals, those are the exact same thing that you can do in a sporting environment, because your performance on the field it's directly dependent upon your emotional state. And by managing your emotions and doing the things that you're talking about, and I do that every day. I've got certain mantras and rituals that I tell myself when I wake up, and it's really helped me significantly. I think that kind of helps people to wrap their mental part of the game into a productive stance that helps them going forward. What do you think about that?
Well, what comes up for me is when we think about people that talk about playing basketball or even golf, they envision themselves with an incredible swing. They envision themselves, seeing that ball go in. and they see that. And so that relates directly to what I was going to say next is actually think about this conversation actually going well. What would happen if it went well? What would be the best case outcome? We're so quick to keep the score against us, to weigh the favors against us. We're so quick to identify the risks. What would the rewards be? What would happen if this worked out? What would that look like? What would an incredible conversation look like? And sort of bringing that vision into the mindset.
Pre-play the shot.
Yeah, do that here in the conversation. See what that feels like. What's the best case scenario?
Well, this is fantastic, Rudhir. I really think you've got some solid content. I like the tactical action steps that you talked about. It's something that doesn't cost us money to do. We can implement it right away. And we focus on our breathing. We write down. We observe the negative feelings or whatever it is that you mentioned, the different symptoms that we have. And then we write down the negative evidence against that and then replay that in our mind and pre-play that shot going well. I think that's great. And tell me about some of the work that you do. Tell us, those that are listening, if they want to reach out to you, we'll put all of your contact information on the show notes, but kind of tell us about the menu of offerings that you have. And then especially I want to hear about the BD circle that you have going on.
Yeah, we'll start with that. I run a business development class. It is a group coaching class, and I call it the BD circle or business development circle. And we get about 10 to 15 attorneys together, partner level or near partner, partner track or partner level attorneys together. And we connect over 6 months, attorneys across the country. And it's an incredible space because we often don't feel comfortable talking to our colleagues about business development. Again, having that conversation, especially because we don't feel comfortable talking to them about when things go wrong.
Right? Sure.
When we reach out to a client and it doesn't work out. And so that ends up feeling very uncomfortable to have in terms of conversation with friends and colleagues. And so I create this space. I create this incredible learning space where we gather, once a week, and we learn over the course of 6 months how to understand your value proposition. How do you create and generate an incredible business plan that relates to the types of clients you want and the business you want to generate? What is that practice you want? What's the plan that we can come up with that really directly brings you closer to living out that vision that you have? And then what are the action steps that you can take? And we really sort of work on coming up with a very unique plan for each of the participants in the program. And then we hold people accountable to that plan over the course of many months. And people come out of the program feeling so much more comfortable having dialogue around developing business or expanding the practice that they have. And so it's just an incredible group learning environment. We often don't get that camaraderie and collegiality around BD. It's the thing that we're sort of left alone to.
Right.
Litigation and legal work can often feel like teamwork, except for business development. We often feel alone in that practice. And so here I've sort of created the space to allow people to do this in community and collectively and get coached on it along the way.
That's a great offering, Rudhir. And we'll definitely put that on the show notes as well if people want to reference that and reach out to Rudhir directly. And Rudhir, thank you for being on the show today. We've got some great ideas. I hope everybody listening can go back and listen to this one again and implement some of the action steps that you talked about. And I look forward to having you back on here again, Rudhir. I'd love to have you back on as a guest in the future.
Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate this time. This was incredible.
Thank you for listening to the Rainmaking Podcast. For more information about our recruiting services for international law firms, visit our website at attorneysearchgroup.com. To inquire about having Scott speak at your next convention, conference, sales meeting, or executive retreat, visit therainmakingpodcast.com.